So sometime before 1846, about 13 miles from here in Walden Pond, this man, Henry David Thoreau, wrote this. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. So if you think about the large number of branches of evil that all of us see in public policy issues across our nation, we can think about a common pattern that many ordinary citizens recognize. So here, for example, is one. This issue is increasingly important, the issue of childhood obesity. This is a 14-year-old boy. It's a picture of what the Center for American Progress calls the child obesity epidemic. Since 1980, the number of obese children has tripled. 1/3 of children over the age of 2 are now technically obese. This epidemic has costs. The most interesting cost, tragic cost, is in the context of type 2 diabetes, a disease which used to be restricted exclusively to old people. Now 1/2 of the new cases are cases with children. The direct costs every year are estimated by the Center for American Progress to be $147 billion. Now you look at this problem and say, why is it we've had this explosion in childhood obesity? When I was a kid, I was pretty fat. I thought this was a genetic problem. But it's a little hard to imagine a whole generation suffering this kind of genetic inhibition that forces them into this obesity. Of course, it's not genetic for a whole generation. Instead, it's, of course, what kids eat. There's a consensus that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. Or it's not actually precisely too much of sugar. It's increasingly criticism of the amount of high fructose corn syrup that we consume. 40% of the products in your supermarket now have high fructose corn syrup. You must puzzle yourself a little bit about why that is. And the answer is because of the relative costs of sugar versus corn. Sugar is relatively expensive versus corn, and the free market aficionados might look at that and say, well, that's just what the market requires. But it's not quite so simple. Sugar in the United States is expensive because tariffs protect 6 domestic manufacturers, giving them about a $1 billion surplus in profits every year, costing the economy about $3 billion in inefficiency costs, because sugar is 2 to 3 times the price in the United States as it is in other equivalent countries. And corn is so cheap in the United States because it's subsidized, $74 billion over the last 15 years, leading some economists to suggest that the cost of producing corn is actually negative. Now, when you take this sugar cost and corn cost and put them together, what you see is a radical shift in first costs for these inputs. So, for example, over the period 1997 to 2003, the cost of vegetables went up by 17%. Cost of a Big Mac went down by 5.4%. The cost of a bottle of Coke went down by 35% because of this shift in input costs. And then there's also a radical shift in how food gets made. I'm sure many of you saw this film, Food, Inc., which describes the consequence of having extraordinarily cheap corn. Because we have cheap corn, it's profitable to produce cattle in this way. Not so profitable for the cattle because cattle can't quite digest corn as a normal digestive process. You've got to feed them tons of antibiotics. And of course, because we feed them tons of antibiotics, we filter out a plentiful collection of new E. coli variations, which of course, if this were a movie, I would now cut to some 4-year-old boy who died because he ate a hamburger. All of this because corn is so cheap and sugar is so dear. Now you might look at this and say, what accounts for such anti-free market silliness in the way that we allocate costs in this sector? And of course, there's no one here who can prove what's accounting for this, but here's what we can say. there's an enormous amount of campaign cash in the mix of these decisions. As the Post put it, 2004, these two leading sugar manufacturers contributed about $925,000 to election coffers. And of course, ADM is famous for spending millions of dollars to drive the cost of corn down. And if it's because of these campaign contributions, we can say campaign money distorts markets, which distorts food production, which distorts our kids. Or here's another example. Think about the Wall Street collapse of just 2 years ago. Many people wonder, why is it we had this collapse? There's a fantastic book by a local hero, Simon Johnson and Yale James Clack, 13 Bankers, which describes this collapse. They take the collapse and focus most directly on its relationship to the Depression and the collapse of 1929. That collapse was, of course, quite severe. And after that collapse, the government came to a recognition that they needed a simple principle to govern in the context of economic matters. That principle was oversight. Every major instrument, from bonds to stocks to savings, had this supervised oversight regulation, aka regulated, in the sense that three principles applied. Number one, they were public. Number two, they were transparent. And number three, they were subject to anti-fraud requirements. In the 1990s, we had a radical new innovation in thinking about financial markets. The innovation was called deregulation. After all, it worked for transportation and for airlines. Why not for banks? And so a whole slew of new instruments were produced subject to private regulations. No publicity, transparency, or anti-fraud requirements required. Now, I asked Frank Partnoy, who studies this, to try to measure the difference between financial instruments under the old regime and financial instruments under the new. He said that in 1980, by his estimate, about 98% of the financial instruments inside the economy were subject to these basic oversight principles. But by 2008, the number had inverted to 90% existing in this shadow market and only about 10% subject to these oversight regulations. And this shadow banking, as Quack and Simon suggest, partly encouraged this bubble, and then that bubble created an enormous systemic risk for the economy. But even that wasn't enough for the market. This deregulation wasn't enough. As Simon and Quack demonstrate, there was also an interesting re-regulation during the last period of this deregulation enterprise. Re-regulation in the form of a government guarantee signaled by the Fed and by changes in the way securities were regulated, so that when this bubble burst, there would be a bailout on the other side. And of course, as Simon and Quack demonstrate, they got this guarantee, producing perhaps the dumbest instance of socialism ever invented by man: socialized risk and privatized benefit. Now, of course, this is an insanely stupid way to run a financial services sector. So why did we do that? Well, of course, none can prove it, but here's what we can say. The fastest growth in campaign contributions of any sector in the United States economy occurred within this sector over the period of the last 25 years. Or another example, think about the Deepwater Horizon and the damage done by that disaster. How is it, many wonder, that such a catastrophe could occur? Weren't there environmental impact and risk studies taken? After all, when we wanted to build this clean energy wind power farm off of the Cape, it took 9 years and 10,000 pages in environmental impact studies before we could get an approval to go forward with that. What about the Deepwater Horizon? How long and how much did it take before they got their approval? Well, the answer was after 17 pages of environmental impact studies, they were exempted from any further impact analysis or requirements. Now, when Congress heard this, of course, Congress was shocked.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here. You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out of...
Yet, of course, as everybody recognizes, it was Congress that had required this extraordinary approval process that would mandate that they could go forward quickly with such experimental drilling rigs. And again, you should say, why is it Congress would have required that? And of course, none can prove it, but here's what we can point to: the endless cash that directed Congress to this end. Or think about global warming. We are 2 years after a Democratic president and supermajority in Congress committed to a global warming package, $110 million spent by groups pushing global warming legislation, and just this July, Senator Reid announces that they are abandoning any efforts at global warming. Why? No one can prove. Here's what we can say: endless campaign cash. Or think about this project, instance for the people on the right, the tax extenders game. Everybody knows about targeted tax benefits. The government announces a certain tax program that applies to just one or a small number of economic entities. Because of pay-go requirements, these tax benefits have to be reauthorized each year. But this reauthorization then has its own political economy around it. As Rebecca Kaysar describes in this article in the Georgia Law Review, that political economy produces a very obvious consequence: an explosion in the number of targeted tax benefits that there are. And why would there be such an explosion that, as in her calculations, more than 20 times over the period that she's describing? Well, because of an obvious dynamic. As a targeted tax benefit is about to expire, there is a huge funding opportunity for members of tax committees to call up the people who are benefiting from the targeted tax benefit and say, you know, we've got to take some serious thought about whether to continue to extend this program again. As she describes it, legislators thus act in their own self-interest by extracting rents and by pleasing certain constituents without concern for the social welfare cost of doing so. So you might think, why wouldn't Congress just eliminate this game with the obvious distorting incentives that it has? Of course, nobody can prove why they don't. We can only say there's endless campaign cash flowed into the system from this. And then finally, think about the health care debate. There's some people who look at the health care bill and say it shows that Barack changed D.C. For example, Ezra Klein, friend on the Washington Post, describes what he calls the twilight of the interest groups. In his piece after the bill passed, the Obama administration succeeded at neutralizing every single industry, Ezra said. Well, right. I actually think Glenn Greenwald had a better sense of what this story demonstrates. As Glenn wrote in response to Ezra, if by neutralizing, Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefits, then he's absolutely right. The way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it had to be done that way, but one cannot deny that it was. Evoking the words of, I think, the 20th century's greatest philosopher, David Byrne, same as it ever was here. Now, the point is, in all of these cases, as we look at these branches of evil that there are so many hacking, we should understand there's also a need to find a root. None can prove this root is money. None can prove that the root is money in campaign contributions. But here's what there's no doubt about: that Americans believe that money buys results in Congress. Overwhelmingly, every single study finds this is the belief of Americans. In the studies I've been part of in California, an 88% return. Republicans and Democrats have that belief. North Carolina, 5-1 belief that money is buying results in Congress. And that belief has an effect. As Rock the Vote just released a study last week showing that the #1 reason why young voters in the Rock the Vote sample will not be voting in this election is because, as the sample puts it, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. That belief that corporate power will block real change leads these people in a 2-to-1 over every other issue that was raised not to vote. And as we think about the vast majority of voters who will not vote in 2010, the kind of sane center who will not vote, leaving the insane extremes to go to the polls. We need to recognize that it's because of this belief, whether true or not, at least in part, that we see this disconnection from the voting system. Now, on January 21st, 2010, in my view, the Supreme Court took a very bad situation and made it much, much worse. Citizens United versus the FEC was the case that made this change. In that case, the court had to decide whether Citizens United, a non-profit political group, would be permitted to distribute and promote this film, Hillary the Movie, using corporate funds. The BICRA statute, which is the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, said no to that, said that this corporation could not, during the last 60 days before an election, use corporate funds to promote electioneering information like this. The Supreme Court said no to BICRA. Said Congress could not block independent expenditures, whether by individuals or corporations. It was in the Buckley case that the court held individuals could not be constitutionally limited, and now in Citizens United, corporations neither. BICRA was therefore in this part declared unconstitutional. Now, after this decision, as you all remember, there was an extraordinary response of liberal outrage, but more interestingly, also conservative outrage. Corporations are not people, many people said. But of course, the Supreme Court never said, in their opinion, that corporations were people. That's not what the opinion hung upon. And many people said corporations should have no right to speak. But I want to be very clear about what my position here is. In my view, it's wrong to say corporations should have no right to speak. My own view is we should constitutionally entitle all sorts of things, whether individuals, citizens, corporations, or dolphins, to a constitutional right to speak, meaning if the government tries to restrict any of them, it needs to justify, under very high standards of justification, this restriction on speech. So this speech, Hillary the Movie, an awful movie, but still a political movie, in my view, ought to have been protected. And the right to distribute it with corporate funds also ought to have been protected. So the result in this case for this particular film is nothing I disagree with. My criticism of Citizens United is not of its recognition of this right to speak by a corporation like Citizens United. My criticism is of the court's reasoning for striking the BICRA statute. Now, the reasoning is complicated, as all Supreme Court opinions are, but there are two parts to it that I want to flag here. The first is its understanding of corruption. The court said that the only kind of corruption that would suffice to give the government a compelling state interest for regulating speech was what they call quid-pro-quo corruption, the kind associated with sweet fellows like Blagojevich, the kind that we think of as coming in brown paper bags, the kind that is regulated by criminal statutes. And the court suggested that the power to regulate corruption beyond that conception of corruption was doubted, which most lawyers read as eliminated. And second, in this opinion, the court suggested that any remaining problem that there was with corporate speech, so liberated, would be cured by disclosure. Congress would have the power to mandate the disclosure of such independent expenditures, and that disclosure would filter into the political system to compensate for the increased amount of speech that corporations had. My view is both of these views are mistaken. First, I think the court needs to recognize that while there is, of course, quid pro quo corruption, there is also something we could call dependency corruption. This is a corruption that comes from an improper dependency, meaning a dependence that competes with the intended dependence for a particular institution or function. So think, for example, of a compass, which is to be dependent upon the magnetic pull towards north. We can imagine a corrupted compass in the sense of creating a competing dependence, another kind of magnetic force just to the to the left of north that would corrupt its ability to serve its function. In that sense, it would be corrupted from the intended relationship that compass was to promote, because the wrong kind of dependency was built in. And that, too, in the ordinary meaning of the term, is a corruption. So as applied to our government, as the originalists like to remind us, we, in our Constitution, established a republic, but that term to the framers simply meant a representative democracy. And as the framers conceived of the different branches of our government, the core democratic branch, Congress, was to be, as Federalist 52 put it, the branch of government which ought to be dependent upon the people alone. So it imagines a democracy where there's an intended dependency, a dependency upon the people. But my suggestion is we all recognize that we don't have a democracy where the Congress is dependent upon the people alone anymore. The people have increasingly been replaced by the funders. As members of Congress spend between 30 and 50, and in some estimates up to 70% of their time raising money, that dynamic produces an obvious dependency, a dependency which conflicts with their intended dependency upon the people, because the funders in this story are plainly not the people. Competing, corrupting dependency, which in my view is just as valid a reason to regulate as quid pro quo corruption is. Indeed, much more important, because I think we need to recognize that quid pro quo corruption, fortunately in the United States federal government, is dead. This is the cleanest Congress we've had since the founding. Our Congress is not a Congress filled with Blagojeviches. There are exceptions, of course, but the problem of this Congress is not people being bribed or engaging in criminal conduct. The problem in this Congress is this in plain sight corruption, which is alive and increasingly sickening. Now, some people might look at this and say, well, are the funders the same as the people? Maybe being dependent upon the funders is functionally the same as being dependent upon the people. And of course, there is a conception of who the funders could be where that would be true. If the funders were distributed in a certain way, then you would say the effect would be the same as being dependent upon the people. But we don't actually see in the data any suggestion to support the idea that the funders are the people. Here's a study of income distribution in state contributions in both gubernatorial and state legislative elections. We don't actually have a similarly rich analysis in the federal level. But if you look at these numbers, some simple way to summarize them is that for people making under $75,000, 80% of them never give anything to political campaigns. And for people making more than $75,000, 80% of them do give something to political campaigns, creating a prima facie gap, in my view, between who the funders are and who the people is. So that's the first point, responding to the question about corruption. Here's the second about disclosure. The court was quite confident that there wouldn't be a problem with the new rules that they were setting out because of this opportunity for mandated disclosure. But I think the court here was missing something pretty important in the dynamics of disclosure, suggested by a paper that was written a number of years ago by Marcus Schaman and Ethan Kaplan, describing what they think of as the iceberg theory of campaign contributions. The iceberg theory builds upon the recognition by, of course, many people here, including Stephen, of the missing money in politics, a suggestion that, in fact, if you think about how much is at stake, the amount of money actually contributed is much less than what ought to be contributed. So if there's a $1 billion rent seeking through sugar manufacturers, they get that $1 billion after spending no more than $3 million in campaign contributions. You would think at least Congress would hold out for more campaign contributions before they handed out such a large amount of money. But what these political scientists suggest is that, in fact, the dynamic of money in politics is more complicated than that. To simplify it, you could say there's an equivalence between my giving you $10,000 and my giving you $2,000 but credibly threatening to give your opponent $8,000. That produces for you the same set of incentives. But for me, I only have to spend $2,000 and I get to reserve the $8,000 and never have to contribute to anybody. So that creates some account in this empirical and theoretical paper for the missing money. And that missing money then defines the gap between what's actually given and what's threatened but not given. Now, what's of course significant about their paper in 2007 was that it was before Citizens United. It was in a world where the most that corporations through this way could give was in PAC contributions, capped at about $10,000 per election cycle. But now as we imagine this shifting into a world of unlimited capacity to give or threaten, the danger presented through this kind of marionette-like relationship has increased significantly. Now, these two problems, I think, suggest that what the court has done is made things much, much worse. What could we do in response? How could we strike at this root, even if not the cause, or at least even if we should say precisely we can't prove that money is causing this effect, we need to recognize it is the cause of this belief, and it's that belief which is sapping the will to participate in politics. Well, I think there are two places we have to respond. Number one, with the court. The court needs to, and I'm quite confident when they get around in the right kind of context to thinking about it, needs to recognize this conception of something like dependency corruption. The framers were obsessed with it. The architecture of the Constitution has an enormous number of little ticks and bends that are precisely understood as responses to the conception of dependency corruption. They were all about how do you build a system so that the right set of dependencies are preserved and the wrong type of dependencies are eliminated. And that objective of avoiding dependency corruption, I think, will be recognized as a compelling state interest. Now, in the way lawyers think about this, that doesn't necessarily mean it would suffice to permit the government to silence anybody's speech. If there are less restrictive alternatives than silencing someone, those would be permitted. But the point is it would be a kind of justification that would allow the court to regulate in all sorts of ways that it can't if that's not recognized as a compelling state interest. And second, for Congress, Congress needs to adopt an idea suggested by a Republican 100 years ago, what I call citizen-funded elections. And in fact, just last week, the House Committee on Administration passed out of the committee and sent to the floor the Fair Elections Now Act, which would allow Congress people to opt into a system where they accepted small dollar contributions only, capped at $100, which would be matched 4-to-1 by the government, permitting them to run campaigns where there was no large dollar contributions in the campaign. Now, that bill, of course, would never pass the United States Senate, but in fact there are the votes right now committed for it to pass the House, and I predict by the end of this session, whether before the election or not, it will pass the House and begin to give people a conception of an alternative to the current way in which we think about dealing with these issues. Because what it does is not completely eliminate the dominance of funders. It doesn't deal with the Citizens United problem, but it does increase the significance of small dollar contributions, which is more directly connected to the people. Maybe that's going to be enough. I think we should see, following the inspiration of the greatest of the progressives, Brandeis, of experimentalism. We should experiment with this to see whether it's enough. But in my view, the objective here is to restore an important democratic institution which is now about bankrupt politically from whatever standard of bankruptcy you would imagine. The latest Gallup poll found the current view of Congress finds 11% of the American public has confidence in the United States Congress, right? Think about what 11% means. There were more people at the time of the founding who believed in the British Crown than believe in our Congress today. If any institution of democracy comes to a point where it doesn't even have this level of support of the people, then that institution of democracy, I think, has a fundamental obligation to change the perception, at least that leads to this erosion in confidence. And my view is at least part, and probably a significant part of that erosion of confidence comes from precisely this perception of most Americans that it's money that's buying results. Thanks very much.